Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Quantum Break for PC and Xbox One. What you're seeing here is the PC version, specifically the Steam release, because there is actually a difference between the Steam release and the Windows 10 Store release. This is a third-person shooter developed by Remedy Entertainment and published by Microsoft in April of last year, and it went on to have a pretty mixed reception overall, both the Xbox One and PC versions. In fact, the PC version got hit harder than that because there were a massive amount of technical problems with the Windows 10 release, and eventually when they did bring it to Steam later on in the year, it was, well, not quite as messy as the technical problems were in the Windows 10 release, but it was still kind of a mess. Then again, we were pretty surprised there was actually a PC version at all, considering that they were building this up as a major Xbox One exclusive, and then it quietly released on Windows 10 as well. Thing is, I'm glad it eventually came to Steam, because apparently the Windows 10 release is a complete disaster in the technical department, and they never really fixed it either. So obviously the way to go on this is the Steam release, although it's really not all roses either. But that's more something I'll talk about in a moment, and in fact that's actually kind of the route that they took when advertising this game. They introduced it as this odd hybrid of video game and TV show, and the idea there is that they tried to integrate the video game parts with TV show episodes that are supposed to be watched in between acts. And leading up to the game's release, they were actually pretty tight-lipped about how it would play as a game, and they were just like, well, on the one hand, it's an action game, so there's plenty of action in the gameplay and everything like that, but there's also pretty heavy emphasis on story because it's got the TV show. It was very confusing marketing, to say the least. And then the game finally dropped, and we got a chance to play it for ourselves. So the question ends up becoming, did Remedy manage to handle the hybrid of TV show and action game, or did something else entirely happen? Let's go ahead and delve into this thing and find out. Well, as far as presentation goes, I have to say it's an incredibly confusing mess. And that's both good and bad. On the one hand, the game actually looks pretty good for the most part. The modeling is generally rather well done, there's quite a lot of detail in the environments themselves, and a few really nice effects here and there, and that gets particularly interesting with all the time dilation going on in the game. But then there's the more iffy parts. For example, you can't seem to turn off motion blur, at least I can't find a way to, and it's pretty annoying because I really hate motion blur. If you've got a game that's running at anything above 30 frames a second, motion blur is completely unnecessary and is in fact more of a detriment than anything else. It really does exist as more of a trick for them to mask how slow the game is actually running than anything else. And I guess that's important with Quantum Break for the technical side of things, which I'll get to in a moment. But then there's other aspects of the presentation to talk about, like the rather mild texture work that tends to pop in quite a bit, or the really weird level of quality that the facial animations and lip syncing have.
Security.
You sure this is somewhere that you want to be sniffing around?
Was that supposed to be a threat? Because that's adorable.
Just walk away.
On the one hand, it's definitely incredibly accurate animation, but on the other, there's just something intangibly weird about it. It's one of those things you really do have to see to understand, which is of course why I showed you that clip just now. I think a lot of people would go immediately to the phrase uncanny valley, but I'm not entirely sure that's accurate here. Anyway, those are really the best animations in the game, because the character animations are generally solid as well, it's just that they're nothing particularly special in an era where we have tons of fantastic animations for characters. And they're also let down by the fact that whenever you go to handle your weaponry, the weaponry itself does not actually react to what you are doing. For example, say you want to reload your pistol. Well, you go through the animation where you would be dropping the mag, inserting a new one, and then racking the slide, but none of that actually happens on the gun itself. There's no mag that falls from the gun, there's no slide racking animation. It's all hand movements, the kind of thing that you would see in games from the early 2000s because they couldn't actually render these things more accurately. In fact, previous games that Remedy has done have had more accurate weapon animations than this. If you need a direct point of comparison, even as far back as the original Max Payne in 2001, it had actual animations for those. It's one of those weird glaring omissions, because pretty much every third-person shooter these days that has modern weaponry in it is going to have that kind of animation, so it is more conspicuous by its absence, and you end up going, wait a minute, why didn't you animate this? And then there's that weird blurry quality to the graphics that you've probably noticed, and that's partly because of the way that the game actually renders. From what I understand, and I don't really understand exactly how the engine works, but it's been explained in an interview. Apparently, if you're like me and you're running the game at 1080p, and you've got the super sampling on, then it renders the game at 720p and scales it up to 1080p on your monitor. And they achieve graphical fidelity with a bunch of filtering effects that they put on there, and it's really, really weird. I'm not sure if that's what the game does at higher resolutions than 1080p as well, if it still renders at 720p and scales it up, but I can't think of any other game that handles its rendering like that. It's just an anomaly as far as game engines go, and it's really not something for the better. Because if you turn off super sampling and you try to render it at the actual resolution, suddenly your frame rate is atrocious. And the game actually ends up looking worse, which is pretty baffling.
After what happened, our people need reassurance that we're in control. You're the man who can win them over. Let me handle Joyce, so you can concentrate on your speech.
I know what's at stake here, Martin.
Mr. Joyce is waiting for us now.
But keep in mind, this is all running on DirectX 11. On the DirectX 12 release, the frame rate is incredibly bad, even on really high-end hardware. And that does not bode well at all for the UWP platform, of course, because that basically forces DirectX 12. And if you've got only DirectX 12 on your game, and your game runs like crap on DirectX 12, then that's not going to be a good time for anyone. But something else that was kind of odd about this, you have to keep in mind that I'm running an i7 4790K, 16 gigs of RAM, and a GTX 970. Certainly not a top-of-the-line system by today's standards, of course, but it is definitely a very powerful rig. And yet, I can't maintain 60 frames a second. And that's not even on the max settings. If I turn this up to the max settings, which is the ultra settings, then my frame rate absolutely tanks down below 20 frames a second, and I actually can't tell a difference visually. If there is a difference, it is absolutely minimal over the high settings. If you want to get more performance out of it than visual quality, then you can put it down to the medium settings, and you're getting basically the same level as what you get on Xbox One. But here's the thing. It's going to run a hell of a lot faster than it does on Xbox One, unless, of course, your hardware is not up to snuff. Although, regardless of your hardware, the cutscenes all run at 30 frames a second, and particularly if you have a high refresh rate monitor, that's going to look pretty terrible when it switches between the 60 plus FPS of gameplay to the 30 FPS cutscenes. So it should be pretty obvious by now that the visuals are a rather mixed bag. But even when you go over to the sound design, things aren't necessarily all that much better. It just depends on what you're talking about. For example, the sound effects mostly suffice. They aren't particularly great, but they aren't bad either. Really, the most interesting sound effects come in when the time dilation effects start going on, because that's when things get a lot more distortion and reverb effects and make it actually sound pretty unique. But during normal firefights and such, you've got some pretty bland, uninteresting weapon sounds that just don't really have enough bass to them. The voice acting, on the other hand, is actually rather well done across the board. They've got a pretty solid cast to this thing, including Dominic Monaghan and Aidan Gillen, along with Shawn Ashmore playing the protagonist. And you should actually be able to recognize them within the game itself in terms of visuals, because they are rendered fully within the game in addition to simply voice acting the characters. And while there are a few sour lines here and there, most of the time the actors do a very good job, and it really does lend quite a lot to the game since it is very dialogue heavy. But then we come to the music, which is a wildly mixed bag. On the one hand, a lot of the music created directly for the game is a bunch of distorted noise. You know, the kind of thing you can lump in with dubstep, a bunch of obnoxious noise that some people seem to think passes for music. Here's the thing, though. It actually fits the game rather well, and that's because time is breaking in the game and there's a crap ton of distortion going on, so it really is kind of indistinguishable from the distortion effects you're seeing in the game. Does that make it good music? No, it just means it's fitting for the game. The licensed tracks, on the other hand, aren't too bad. In fact, one bit of the game has a very, very brief appearance of the Toto song Africa, and if you haven't heard that, then you've been living under a rock. Granted, it does feel rather out of place in the grand scheme of things here, but at the same time, it's Toto's Africa. I mean, come on. It's just too damn catchy. But when you take everything as a whole, you end up with something that is just wildly inconsistent. The frame rate isn't consistent. I couldn't maintain 60 FPS on my rig, and while it was never unplayable even on the high settings, it was certainly annoying at times. The visuals themselves really didn't justify that performance either. The Windows 10 Store version of the game is pretty much a complete disaster from a technical standpoint. The sound design is decent but otherwise unremarkable, and ultimately it all just ends up not really impressing you all that much. But of course what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, and I'm actually going to talk about the gameplay first because there's barely anything worth talking about here. It uses an automatic cover system to where when you move close enough to an object that can be used as cover, you'll automatically crouch behind it and take less hits as a result. The problem is, like all games that use that style of cover, it really doesn't work all that well when you're actually playing the game, and you end up just going, wait a minute, I'm not in cover, no, now I'm in cover, no, wait, no, I'm not in cover, or maybe I am, I really don't know, and it's the kind of thing that makes you want a cover button instead of just being able to move up to the thing and actually have cover. Because the thing is, if you have a dedicated cover button, at least you know when you're in cover and when you're not in cover. If you don't have that, then it's just kind of a crapshoot. Because a lot of the time you'll move in a crouched manner anyway, even if you're not in cover, so you really don't know unless you're just not taking much damage, which is just kind of irritating. But here's the thing, you're probably not going to want to be using that anyway because you have other methods available to prevent you from taking damage. The most obvious of these are your time powers. These are various powers that you get throughout the course of the game, and they expand more as you continue through the game, of course. And of course, they can also be upgraded because every game ever has to have an upgrade system now. So you get your upgrade points by finding various Cronin sources throughout the levels and just completing the levels in general, and eventually you can put points into your powers to give them some passive bonuses, like increased duration or increased damage resistance for your bullet shield, or a sort of bullet time mechanic that triggers whenever you use the time dash that allows you to slow down time for a brief while you're aiming. The other powers that you get access to are a bullet shield that, of course, prevents enemies from damaging you, a sort of sprinting mechanic that also allows you to do takedowns, a power that gives you the ability to stop time in a very localized area, and then you can actually stack bullets on that particular spot, and once that bubble collapses, then all of those bullets just immediately hit whatever they were going toward. Then of course there's a basic time blast that does a lot of damage and basically serves as a sort of localized explosion, and finally a vision power. And you'll be utilizing all of these powers to both avoid damage as well as dispatch your enemies in the most efficient manner possible, or just simply the flashiest manner possible, whichever you prefer. There are of course environmental hazards that you can use to your advantage as well, like exploding barrels or the barrels of chronon particles that will cause a localized stutter. But the gunplay itself is very basic, and you're dealing with a lot of enemies that are really defined more by what weapon they're using than anything else. The enemy variety consists of your basic guys with pistols, shotguns, assault rifles, and submachine guns, as well as some heavy troops that can take a hell of a lot of punishment before going down, but they're all really slow, and then eventually you run into enemies that are capable of using some of the same time power mechanics that you are, like the dash move in particular. And finally, you will run into some enemies that have to be attacked at a specific weak point in order to be damaged. Now, other than those, pretty much everybody just goes down in a bunch of headshots without any issues. It's a rather simplistic combat system when you really get down to it, and it's really not that satisfying. Enemies can feel like total bullet sponges a lot of the time, and you can just sink a ton of SMG rounds into people before they finally fall down. In fact, it takes a lot of assault rifle and shotgun rounds to bring somebody down too, unless you basically shove the shotgun down their throat. It really does scream the fact that you're supposed to go for headshots and not much more than that, because if you do anything else, you don't get a damage bonus for it, and thus you're just going to sit there wailing on things until they finally fall over. And the time powers themselves really don't spice up the gameplay all that much either. They're fairly basic powers that you have seen before in other games, and while ultimately they do help to make the combat a bit more interesting than simply wailing on enemies until they fall over, it still really isn't a very good combat system when you get down to it. Serviceable, but really nothing more than that. It also doesn't help that with the mouse there's some slightly odd mouse acceleration going on in the game that I couldn't seem to turn off, and it did make aiming feel a bit clumsy until I finally got used to it, so your mileage may vary on that. But here's the thing, that's pretty much the extent of the gameplay other than moving forward and watching cutscenes. There are some extremely basic platforming and puzzle elements that are just brain dead simple. I mean, you can turn back time in certain places to allow you to jump across something, or otherwise traverse the environment. But other than that, you're dealing with an extremely simple third-person shooter that is actually primarily just walk-forward cutscene. This means that it really does fall to the story and the dialogue to bring things up, because the gameplay itself is fairly bland and uninteresting when you really get down to it. And what you have there is the protagonist Jack Joyce going back to his hometown to meet with a guy named Paul Serene as one of his old friends, who is wanting to show him something amazing, which in this case is a time machine. And it was built off the back of Jack's brother's research that had been going on for quite some time at that point. He had discovered something called chronon particles and was trying to figure out how to manipulate them in order to basically enable time travel. Thing is that Jack's brother Will managed to get off of the project quite some time ago, and he was kind of turning into a madman as far as you could tell at the beginning of the game, ranting and raving about how what they're doing is a terrible thing and it could be catastrophic if it comes to fruition. Well, Paul manages to complete the machine with the help of his company, Monarch Solutions, and ends up getting Jack to help him set up the machine and activate it in order to basically test it out and make sure time travel works. The thing is, it does work. He ends up going forward a bit in time and basically talking to himself as well as talking to Jack. Of course, something goes horribly wrong while they're messing around with the machine, and it ends up creating a fracture in time that slowly starts to expand, and it also messes up both Paul and Jack. In Jack's case, the effects tend to manifest as the various time powers that he gets, but in Paul's case, it manifests in the fact that he can see the future, so to speak. At certain points in the game, it comes up with something called a junction, and that's where Paul has to make a decision that can affect the outcome of the following chapters, as well as the TV show. This, of course, does give you some degree of replayability, but I actually went back and looked through all the various effects that the junctions have, and it's really not a huge difference depending on which one you pick. Ultimately, all the main events are going to be the same no matter what you do. It's just that leading up to that, you're going to have different circumstances. You might fight someone somewhere where you wouldn't fight them if you had another path. Or somebody might die in one timeline, but they won't die in another one. It's enough to make things a bit more interesting for if you do decide to go back and play it, but it's really not enough to justify playing through the game twice in one go. But despite this functionality, the general crux of the story is going to be the same regardless. Jack is trying to get whatever countermeasure his brother developed in order to stop the fracture and thus prevent the end of time from happening, and Monarch Solutions is trying to stop him from doing this. They have their own plan for dealing with the end of time, and they definitely don't want Jack messing that up. Of course, it does get more complicated than that as you go through the game. It tries to explain to some degree how the time travel mechanic actually works. It tries to explain some of the theory behind the time travel, but it's actually not very good at explaining it. In fact, the game kind of makes fun of how bad it is at explaining it, because they constantly have this time is an egg metaphor, and they just eventually start going, wait a minute, no, just stop with the egg metaphor, it's stupid. And thus it tries a hell of a lot harder to focus on the relationship between Jack and Paul, as well as the actual conflict of trying to find the countermeasure and get it applied so you can fix the fracture, versus the Monarch solution of trying to prepare for the end of time instead. They try to make things complicated, and they try to give it a bunch of moral gray area, but at the same time, they still end up falling into the same pitfall of, well, Monarch is big evil corporation doing big evil corporation things. And unfortunately, it's not like any of the characters within Monarch itself can actually pick up the slack. They don't really have all that much personality to them. In fact, none of the characters in this game really have all that much personality. There's hints of it here and there, some bits of sarcasm, some bits of wit, but the vast majority of the game, they are too busy being concerned with the breakdown of time to really be proper characters. It's almost like the writers designed them to be vehicles for the plot rather than characters, and that ends up being a pretty big detriment because you don't really have anybody you can latch onto and be like, hey, I really like this character. Some are a bit better than others, but most of them are just bland and uninteresting. And it really doesn't help that when they do show up in the actual TV show parts, it ends up being material that is really not all that interesting and not all that helpful to your understanding of the game itself. You would think they would use the TV show as a vehicle for exploring things they can't really do in the game's context, because in the game you're always playing as Jack, or in the Junction's case as Paul, so your perspective is really limited in the confines of the game. They could use the TV show to expand upon the story through other characters' eyes, and that's pretty much what they try to do with it, but unfortunately they really aren't able to expand upon the story very much in the TV show because most of the content there is just side stuff. I mean, a very large chunk of the first episode of the show is basically showing how conflicted Burke is, which should make him a more compelling character, but instead he spends the entire episode basically moping around. He goes home to his wife and she's not particularly happy with him because he keeps having to go away for work, and nothing is really solved or moved forward as a result of things that go on within that particular episode. And that episode takes up a good half-hour chunk of the game. You have to keep in mind that on a single playthrough you're looking at maybe 8 or so hours of game, and about 2 of that is TV show. And what you get isn't a really high quality TV show. You get basically a Sci-Fi Channel original, only not a very good one. It covers content that isn't going to show up in the main game, and in fact it doesn't actually have much bearing on the main game at all. And when they try to do action sequences, it is just bog standard TV show action at its absolute best, and most of the time it just ends up being pretty weakly shot. And then when you actually get back into the game, it doesn't have any effect on what you're experiencing while you're playing as Jack Joyce. In fact, a lot of the stuff, if it does apply to Jack, is just redone within the confines of the game's cutscenes. There is a huge missed opportunity there, and the show just ends up being incredibly boring as a result. In fact, you could either fast forward through the episodes or outright skip them entirely and miss pretty much nothing in the confines of the game. And it's a real shame too, because not only does it not enrich your experience of the game, but it actually makes it considerably worse because it pretty much forces you to watch the episodes. Whenever you finish one of the game's acts, it immediately puts you into the TV show episode, and you have to skip through the episode in order to get to the next chapter. Luckily, they give you the option to skip through the episode entirely, but you're still dealing with a period of time between when one act ends and the next one begins, where you can't really do much of anything. It just sits there saying end of act whatever and is forcing you to skip through these various TV show episodes in order to get to the next chapter. It just ends up grinding the game to a screeching halt, and what makes matters worse is that the TV show episodes are streamed. At least they are on the Windows 10 version and I believe the Xbox One version. I'm not 100% sure on the Steam version either, but the game install is 70 gigabytes, and the quality of the TV show episodes varied pretty wildly when I was actually watching them. You would think that if the files were actually installed to the game's directory, then they would be of the highest quality level instead of having some pretty fluctuating quality, meaning that it sounds like the TV show episodes are streamed on the Steam release as well. And with a 70 gigabyte install, that is downright absurd. It's already a ridiculously huge installation, you might as well throw the TV episodes in there. But instead, it looks like they're always streamed, which means that you basically have to be always online on this thing, because if you're not, then it's not going to let you watch the TV show episodes. Now, whether or not this actually affects the game itself, as in it prevents you from playing it, I really don't know. I do believe you can, in fact, play this while it's offline, you just won't be able to get those streamed TV episodes, which means that you're missing out on a good 2 hours of content. Granted, it's pretty crappy content, but it's still about 2 hours of content. And when the game is really short to begin with, that's really not a good thing. Ultimately, I can applaud Remedy for trying something really different with this one. I don't really know of any other video game out there that's tried to combine a video game and a TV show in the same go. But the problem is that the end result here is just incredibly disappointing. It is a really weak third-person shooter with some rather wimpy writing, some bland, uninteresting characters. The TV show itself is bland, uninteresting, and really not all that well integrated into the game itself. And to top it all off, you're dealing with some pretty massive performance issues, particularly on the Windows 10 release. And ultimately, I really can't recommend Quantum Break at all. It's not that it's a terrible game or anything, it's just not a good one either, or even really an average one. The technical problems definitely saw to that. Ultimately, I give it a 2 out of 5. Really, really disappointing. I hope that Remedy manages to redeem themselves after this, because this was downright depressing. Thanks for watching.